Welcome back. And thank you so much to our first panel. It was incredibly fascinating and also left us with some hope. So this is wonderful. We're now going right into our next session, which is focusing on outputs, and where we actually will continue the theme of hope, but we'll also talk about some of the challenges, of course, that we're facing. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, although you'll see it's not quite the normal panel. Our panelists, all of them right now, and then I'm going to disappear, and then in fact we will have 5 short talks, so think TED-style lightning talks by each of the panelists, and then we'll be joined by a moderator and have a bit of a conversation here. Okay, so with that, you're in for a real treat. I'm going to do this in order of appearance. So we first will be joined by Regina Barzilai, who is a professor at MIT and also is the leading faculty of the MIT Jameel Clinic. We then have our second speaker, Frida Polly, is an award-winning Harvard and MIT-trained neuroscientist turned AI startup CEO, and I think since then returning to MIT, and so we have her back in academia. Then we will be joined by Professor Sherrod Goel. He is my colleague at the Kennedy School. He applies computer science to questions of public policy broadly, and will talk about topics such as criminal justice or work. Then, fourthly, we'll be joined by Ana Cristina Bicara. She is a professor at the Department of Applied Computing at the Universidade Federal do Estado do Rio de Janeiro, and she's also the founder of the Active Documentation and Intelligent Design Lab. And then fifthly, we'll be joined virtually by Jamila Smith-Loud, who is a user researcher on Google's Trust and Safety team. She uses research to advocate for diverse needs and perspectives. And then I'm also delighted to introduce our moderator, who is joining us from Harvard Business School, Professor Ram Koenig. He explores research and teaching on how to help entrepreneurs, scientists, and innovators succeed. On that note, I would like to warmly welcome Regina up to the stage.
Hello, and so very delighted to be here. Really a beautiful morning here, and I always run in this area. I live nearby, but I've never been inside, so thank you very much for inviting me. So, the title of my talk, and I will make it in 7 minutes, is how AI can correct pseudoscience on women's health. And you may be thinking, where is this pseudoscience? So let me just start with a pseudoscience that is currently part of our medical establishment at FDA. So since 2023, FDA requires every mammography provider, so everybody here who took mammogram, I would not ask you to say who did, because it will tell me your age, but at any rate, every one of us who does mammograms get a letter that says that if you have dense breasts, that you are in increased risk of breast cancer. This was actually an addition that is required. Over 40% of American women have dense breasts, so over 40% of the women get this letter. So now let's ask ourselves, how much truth in this particular statement that FDA requires your provider to tell you? And here we need to actually go back historically and look at the doctor, John Wolfe, who in '60 asked a very reasonable question. The question was, if I'm looking at a mammogram of a woman that later developed breast cancer, are there any signs previously in this image? It's really a great question. And the first speaker who taught you about AI told you about how people cannot really well distinguish the science in an image. It's really, really hard. But he actually came up with some rules, and you can see that he was so optimistic that in '60s, he said that he used computers to read mammogram. I cannot even fathom what it means, but at any rate, he did it. And American College of Radiology adapted his rules into something which is called density. For those of you who are not familiar, you can just look at these images. What it means is how much fibrous tissue do you have in your breast. So when you have a lot of white on a mammogram, it means that you have a dense breast. If you have fatty breast, it doesn't mean that you are fat. It just means that you have less fibrous tissue. And you see them, I think, in the left. So in the United States, what type of breast do you have? Again, over 40% have dense breast, means that your insurance may cover different screening differently. There are states where you are supposed to get a supplemental screening. There are lots of things that are riding on this determination. And by the way, doctors, there were a lot of studies that shows that if they're looking at the image, some of them, they look at the big set of images, some of them identified 8% as dense, others found 80% as dense. So they cannot even agree on that. But let alone say whatever. They somehow decide what is your density, gave you letter. And then the question, does it mean that you actually are in risk of breast cancer? And, I was personally a skeptic. So the last few months, I collected the largest set existing for studying this question. We had over 1.6 million mammograms that come from different parts of the United States and the world, with 625,000 patients. And then we asked the question: if I'm now taking a woman with a dense breast, what is the likelihood she's actually developing this breast cancer? And we use standard measures, relative risk, odds ratio, whatever. That's what they use in their traditional paper. And look at this. For instance, if you combine all this big data set, your likelihood to get breast cancer, like if you're looking at C index, is 0.51. Random is 0.5. You can say, okay, but I got another one. 1%, it's perfect, but you got maybe it means something. For comparison, if you're looking at age, again, it doesn't mean that if you are old, you're having breast cancer, but even if you're asking a question, what is my likelihood to get breast cancer if I'm above 70, the same index is going to be 56. But nobody gives you a mammogram and says, now that you are above 70, we are going to treat you as if you're already entering breast cancer center. We're going to buy you a week for chemotherapy. So how come, this kind of wrong information is propagated? It's not only part of what FDA gives to you. If you look at the standard treatment for women like NCCN, which is our screening and prevention for cancer, breast density is very, very commonly used. And this is like the numbers that we are using and misinforming women. Now, why do I care? Because many years ago, actually in April 2014, I went and I did one of my mammograms. And, and I did it at MIT. And they told me, you have dense breasts. They gave me the letter, even it was not required at the time, and told me, you can, no worries about it, because, most of the MIT women have dense breasts. The younger you are, the higher likelihood you have dense breasts. Guess what? I said, there is nothing to worry about it. And then eventually, actually, I did my first mammogram in 11, but at 14, I did got breast cancer. Here you can see my son trying to do a barber job before chemotherapy. And if you are looking at my images in 2014, 13, and 12, what you will see here is that the cancer that was diagnosed in 14 was actually visible in 13, and it was visible in 12. And what the study demonstrates that I was not unique by any chance, because there are lots and lots of women, over 30% of women, in fact, that their cancer is visible in a previous mammogram. So the question that we ask, that's where AI comes in, because I'm professor of computer science, not MD. Can we take an image before you see any signs of cancer and predict the likelihood of you developing breast cancer in 5 years? And it turns out, as you can see here, the publication, you can with very good accuracy. How do you do it? You feed to the machine the images where 5-year outcomes. So if we are going to take the images of women who took their mammogram in 19, you know what happened to them in the next 5 years, and that's how you train the machine. It works really well. As you can see, densities that currently we are informing is 0.5. You got 77. It's not perfect, but we're talking about 5 years. If you want to predict in 2 years, it's actually above 80. And at this point, we try this model on a very diverse population. It's a beautiful slide, so I didn't update it. But we have over 2 million mammograms, around the world that we tried the model. It seems to be very consistent, which is important because human cannot validate predictions of the model. And then I just want to tell you, I'm talking about breast, but I want to tell you about other cancer where we're doing a lot of work, it's lung cancer. And as you know, that the leading cause of cancer deaths for women is actually lung cancer. And the funniest part is that screening guidelines in the United States today are severely disadvantages women. 50 to 80% of female cancer patients that are diagnosed, if you're looking back, they are not eligible for screening. The insurance will not pay for screening. Why? Because our screening guidelines are based on heavy smoking. Women were not heavy smokers, and now there is increase in lung cancer for non-smoking women. So they're really falling off the wagon. So I want to finish with my wish list. First of all, I think the advocacy here is really we have to change guidelines for screening for breast and lung cancer. I don't work on others. I'm sure there is a place to improve there as well. Second of all, we really have to move this gap of transitioning the technology, all these advances to really care. Now there is a humongous gap, and I don't know, maybe these things that we're presenting now is going to be 30 years later in the care, but how many women will die in between? And final thing that I want to say, it's really important to develop healthcare tool on data that represents all of us and represents women. And currently most of the development is done on the UK data, on the data sets that have more men than women. So it's time to advocate and change it. Thank you very much.
Okay, I was worried I might talk fast, but given Regina, I'm not so worried anymore. Okay, perfect. So hi, I'm Frida Pali. I am a trained Harvard and MIT neuroscientist. Then I started an AI company back in 2012, in the old days of AI, and now I'm back at MIT as a visiting innovation scholar. And I'm here to tell you about fairness-optimized AI, which at this point is fairly old hat, but back in 2012 and 2013 was a novel concept. So as a neuroscientist, I'm here to tell you something unpopular. Danny Kahneman wrote about this in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. The brain really has two hardwired systems, a fast-thinking system and a slow-thinking system. Unfortunately, a lot of problems with bias come in with the fast-thinking system. It's great for when you see a tiger, makes you think tiger, danger, run. Very important evolutionarily. It's not so great for hiring when that's the pattern recognition system that says female nurse, don't hire for an engineering role. And the problem is we can study, well, the good part is we can study this level of bias using what are called callback studies. So essentially what they do in a callback study is they literally just change the name. So if you want to look at race, instead of calling the person John, you say Jamal or Juan. And what you see is that with identical resumes, equally qualified candidates, for every 10 interviews that John gets, Jamal gets 7 and Juan gets 8. So this is the problem that we're faced with. For women, it really varies by profession. So for nurses, actually, women are more likely to be hired. But for jobs like engineering, math and engineering, the ratio of women to men getting callbacks or getting brought in for an interview is 6 for every 10 that men are getting. This is clearly a problem. Unfortunately, or fortunately, you cannot sue somebody for unconscious bias because we all have it. So legally, you're not allowed to. This is legally impenetrable, essentially. And even worse, unconscious bias training doesn't work. People still continue to do it, but there's at least a decade of research showing that removing bias from the human brain doesn't work. It's an unpopular thing to say out loud, but I feel like I have to be the bearer of bad news. So this was my inspiration for starting a platform with my female co-founder, both of us coming out of MIT, thinking, hey, we can do better. We know we can't remove bias from the brain. However, we can attempt to remove bias from AI. And so really that's what we focused our system on. Again, this was back in 2012. There are lots of other systems now that do this. So, but I think as one of the pioneers, we also did a lot of work in terms of validation and transparency. So I think this is still relevant. So the first thing that one should do when trying to remove bias from machine learning is start with as unbiased data sets as possible. That's why we used to use cognitive, social, and emotional traits from people as opposed to resume data, which is very, very hard to unbias. And secondly, it's just an iterative process of basically model selection and tuning. And through this process, we were able to produce some pretty significant improvements over what the human brain can do. And again, that's where our technology would come in. It wasn't replacing interviews or anything beyond that. It was really when either a human or a much more old-fashioned and equally biased automation tool was at play. We had an independent set of researchers, Alan Mislov and Krista Wilson, over at Northeastern come in 2019 to basically validate and verify that the mechanisms that we were describing in the platform were actually being implemented, and they presented this at FACT, and then Brookings and others wrote about these algorithm audits. And what did we find in doing this? So again, perfect parity would be 10 to 10, and that's what we are striving for always. Our system didn't quite achieve that, but as you can tell, if you compare previous performance being 7, 9.5 is a huge improvement, and for Hispanics, the previous performance was 8, so 9.7 is a huge improvement. And these are what are called impact ratios, so all hiring tools have to produce their own impact ratios. It's a legal requirement. However, the problem is that a lot of this is kept opaque, and I'll get to that in a minute. Also show you that for gender, the results were equally compelling, I think. So 9.7 for every 10 candidates passed through for women in computer and mathematical fields. Again, these data are from about 500,000 people that went through the system. These data were collected in 2019, so it's a bit dated. I know that we have continued to improve upon the platform, and the goal is really to get to a 1-to-1 ratio. But one of the things that became apparent to me in building this technology is that while these impact ratios are calculated, they're kept hidden in desk drawers, protected by armies of lawyers, because basically those impact ratios can make you legally liable for a bunch of different things. And unfortunately, people will say in private contexts that everybody knows these hiring algorithms have disparate impact. Disparate impact is a legal term that says if your ratio is 8 to 10 or lower, basically you have disparate impact. So anything above 8 is legally acceptable, and then above 9 is basically considered very defensible. The problem, again, is that impact ratios, while calculated, are hidden and protected because people don't want to get sued. So we worked with 2 African-American women in city council in New York City, where my company was based, to basically pass a law requiring public disclosure of impact ratios and independent verification of this by an external party. The law was passed in 21, and it went into effect in 23. It really was the first law in the nation to require disclosure of these impact ratios in algorithmic hiring. Unfortunately, we had a mayoral change between 21 and 23 when it went into effect. You may know our mayor, Mayor Adams. He's been in the news for other things. Unfortunately, the law was not promoted and got pretty gutted in implementation. However, it's on the books, and subsequent mayors hopefully will do a bit of a better job in implementing this law. And luckily, I think, there are at least 12 states in the country that have put in their laws some aspect of disclosure of impact ratios. Because again, I think that unless we know how these algorithms are performing, despite the legal liability that might occur, we will never improve upon these systems. There are detractors of fairness-optimized AI. So some people, and I'm just giving one example, but I've heard this from many people, if you remove the bias, you remove the signal. That's basically saying that there's something inherent about being a female or being a different ethnicity that potentially makes you, less good at whatever role you're in. I would argue as a woman in technology, I can relate to a lot of the comments made previously that I was always good at math, and I really enjoy math, and I want to continue doing math and science. And I actually don't believe that this is the case, but there are some folks out there that really think that there's something inherent about people. Enforcing equal life outcomes ignores differences in ability and ambition that might reasonably justify differences in outcomes, is kind of their perspective. So just letting you know that there are detractors of of fairness-optimized AI. However, I'm going to end on a positive note. There are also lots of folks that really see fairness-optimized machine learning as a tool for quality. Thank you, Dr. Bonet, for inviting me here, and others who have seen the benefit that this technology can bring. Thank you very much.
Great. Hi, everybody. I'm really enjoying this session. So I'm gonna, actually, my time has already started. So I'm going to try to talk about two distinct projects related to this idea of blinding to reduce bias in both human decisions, but also to audit algorithmic decisions. So I'll start with using AI to reduce bias in human decisions. So in the United States, after somebody is arrested, prosecutors have to decide whether or not to bring charges. This is a very high stakes decision. If the prosecutor moves forward with charging, then the entire criminal legal process starts. If they decide to decline charging, then for all intents and purposes, that person is done with the criminal legal system. And in large part, in many jurisdictions, these decisions are based on the narratives that officers are writing up when they conducted that arrest. And like we saw in this last talk, there are all sorts of biases that can creep in when prosecutors are reading these narratives to determine whom to charge, both implicit and also explicit. And so we developed an AI-based tool, a generative AI-based tool, to automatically mask race-related signals from these police narratives. So I'm going to give you a very simple example here. So here's a toy example. Most of these narratives are they're a couple pages long, so I'm just giving you a short example here. And so in here, there's already lots of indications of somebody's race. So for example, the explicit mention of black male here. And so here we're going to redact that and just say race male on the right. Of course, we want to be careful. So the color black jacket, there we want to leave it. So this is one of the things that makes it tricky. Brown hair, again, physical descriptor, we don't need to have that. We're going to replace that with hair color. Names, we know, are often indicative of race, so we're going to remove that. But we have to maintain the connection of name in their various forms throughout the narrative. Locations, because of residential segregation, knowing where an arrest or an incident took place, we often know about the race of the people involved, and so we're going to change that to neighborhood. So this is, and one more, with officer names, we've even been told that prosecutors become so familiar with the officers that they know where they work, and if they know where they work, what part of the city they work in, they can already back out, location, and then by segregation, the race of the people involved. So in some instances, we even redact that. So we went from the original narrative, which had all sorts of indications of race, to something like this, where race is relatively obscured. And we use generative AI to produce these narratives, but we also use AI to test these narratives. So when we use the original narratives, we have an adversarial model that tries to predict race from the original narratives, and we also have an adversarial model that tries to predict race from the redacted narratives. And then we go back and forth until we preserve the signal that's useful for prosecutors, while also reducing the ability to detect race from these redacted narratives. This work ended up inspiring legislation in California that mandates the use of race blinding in these types of decisions, which went into effect of January 1st of this year, and now running randomized controlled trials across the country to gauge the effectiveness of this. The second thing I want to talk about is now using the same idea of blinding to detect bias in AI decisions. So this is very much related to the work that we saw in the last presentation. So AI, as we know, is now used in a variety of contexts, including in employment for job screening. And so we wanted to test these algorithms, these AI algorithms, for bias in those screening or job recommendation decisions. And so we started out with a real corpus of about 1,000 applications to K-12 positions in a large public school district. We then use the same methodology that we just heard about, this callback methodology, this audit study methodology, where we indicated in those applications, we provided indicators of race and gender, for example, by changing names and pronouns. And then we fed these applications through these AI systems to see how would decisions ultimately change. And what we found was actually quite surprising. And so what we found here, so we were expecting that when we did this, we were going to find bias against women, against racial minorities, but we found the opposite effect, that when we gave the AI indications that the applicant was female or the applicant was from a racial minority group, then by and large, what we saw was that, that those applicants were given higher ratings. So all else being equal, women and racial minorities were given higher ratings by the algorithm. So again, this was kind of counter our own expectations. It's not the only finding in this vein, but it was counter to our initial expectations. And so what is it that's going on? It's very hard to understand exactly what's going on. These are complicated black box algorithms, but our conjecture is that this is part of the post-training effect. So these algorithms, the way that they're built, there's a training phase, basically slurping up the internet and making, predictions based on that. But then there is a post-training alignment phase where we're going in, much like we saw again in the last presentation, where humans are going in and modifying, tweaking these algorithms to get, in many cases, better, fairer outcomes. But it's very hard to reason about this complex interplay between the training, the pre-training, and the post-training. And one of the punchlines of our work is that the directionality or the magnitude of the effects that you might see in aggregate from this entire training process are very hard to predict. And so that's one of the reasons why we think it's important to have these types of empirical investigations before when we're evaluating these types of algorithms. So I want to end by making this distinction between disparate treatment and disparate impact. So our audit study that I just mentioned seeks to measure the direct effects of race on AI decisions, and similarly, the race blinding algorithm that I presented at the beginning is trying to mitigate the direct effects of race on human decisions. But in neither case can we detect or mitigate disparate impacts of unjust policies that may not really consider race or gender directly. And so one example is we put out a job ad that says that we need all sorts of job requirements that really, like advanced degrees, lots of experience, that are in some sense race and gender neutral. But if those are not fundamentally required to do the job, then having those types of requirements could lead to unjust disparities in our outcomes. So that is not something that our detection can actually detect, or our audit studies can detect, and it's not something that the types of race and gender blinding that we've been talking about is able to mitigate. But I do believe that algorithms, when they're appropriately designed and used, can in fact reduce inequality. We just have to be careful to distinguish between the algorithmic interventions and the underlying policy interventions. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here and to explore why transparency is the cornerstone for fairness in AI. I'm from Brazil, and there we are this close to passing a law regulating AI, and I'm glad that transparency is a fundamental requirement. Transparency is personal for me, so let me tell a story that happened when I was a PhD student at Stanford a long time ago. So as you can imagine, as PhD student is very stressful, especially in the last year. And for me, it was especially hard because my husband had to return to Brazil due to a job offer, and I stayed there alone with my 5- and 4-year-old kids. Very cute, but you can imagine hard work. My son was having a problem at school, so I decided to make myself available every Friday morning to volunteer at his school, painting faces, telling stories, kid stuff to help my son to fit in. And when my husband had some free time, he would come visit us and cover for me at his school. Fast forward to kindergarten graduation. So tiny diplomas, kids' presentation, proud parents. And then the director announced a special award for a super parent volunteer, the one that made the kid first despite a million other priorities. I was sitting there, so my mom is there. And then she called my husband's name. And he wasn't even there. So I smiled, accept the prize on his behalf, but inside I was like a volcano of disbelief. Why him? What were the criteria? I don't know. So the process was not transparent. Probably what was expected from moms was different than what was expected from dads. So the little effort my husband did was enough to give him the prize. This is human bias. I am a computer science professor, a Latina, a woman in my 60s with a strong Brazilian accent, so I feel biases most people would miss. And now these biases are inside something more massive, artificial intelligence that learn from us, our past, our choices, our flaws. And the risk is blind trust in systems we barely understand. So I had another project. I have a project that deals with bank data set. So I had access to this large data set, and at that, with millions of loan transactions. And at that point, the bank was deploying an AI system to automate loan approval and to set payment conditions. And I said, well, let's look to find some discrimination, some bias, and we look every angle, and look at many proxies. There's a lot of parameters that build the system. And bottom line, we decided to do something different. Okay, let's get and do an alternative AI system trained only with data from the male clients. So we did it, and when we tested with the guys, the performance was really good, very accurate. So the predicted interest rate matched what the bank was actually charging clients. So we said, okay, let's use the same model, but let's switch and check what's going to happen with data from the female clients. What do you think had happened? Women paid more. So, and I think that here, transparency was very important to show the bank that if they deploy the system that they are building, they would perpetuate bias against women. So this was very important to show. In another project, looking at data from mobility apps, we were trying to understand why mobility apps have a very high rate of cancellation. Even, accept the ride and it's canceled. It's about 60%. So we are looking for reasons, and we found something very interesting. So the ride cancellation pattern showed us that public authorities will respond faster to incident that happens in wealthier neighborhood. So here, transparency was kind of a megaphone for accountability. How come? So in another project, we are developing AI system to help doctors, oncologists, to decide if when a patient arrives in emergency care, if they should be admitted for further treatment. So there is limited resources, so you need to decide that. And here, in addition to giving a recommendation, the system is made transparent so the doctors will know have a good explanation of the reasons for that recommendation. And this will help, it will help doctors to decide to trust or not in the recommendation. So this is very important, this transparency. My latest project is very fun to do, is about chatbots. I am 100% sure that everybody here have used ChatGPT or similar to, draft an email, fine-tune a petition, debug some code. So they are very impactful and powerful and elegant, but they are brimming with bias. So I want to understand more about them. But instead of digging into code, I decided to interview them. So one of my questions was kind of, okay, how do you perceive women and men as your users? Very interesting, their answers. So men are tech-savvy, problem solvers. Women, well, very curious about soft stuff, caregiving. So if we rely in these elegant systems to suggest a person for being a CEO of a data science company, who do you think they would suggest? Probably not a woman. So where do you go from here? So my message is clear. I think I am a fan of AI. I have been using it for a long time, and I think it can benefit us, make life simpler, better, hopefully just. But let's face it, there is no perfect code. There is always going to be bias because we are biased. They are a reflection of us. What we can fight for and demand is to have transparency in this system so we as society can decide if the biases inside it are still acceptable legally, socially, ethically. So this is my message to you. We should demand transparency for AI system. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jamila Smith-Loud. I work in Google Research in our human-centered AI and ML team, and I lead a team called the Impact Lab, which is a bunch of interdisciplinary researchers who are thinking about how to understand impacts of AI on vulnerable populations and in sensitive domains, and then thinking through tools and artifacts that can be used to mitigate harms to those groups and in those domains. So really excited to be here, and my apologies for not being there in person today. Today, I was going to talk a little bit about our approach navigating the complex landscape of gender and AI, given the theme of this conference. And I'll discuss our commitment to human rights and how we integrate that into our research processes and then eventually our research artifacts. So certainly our approach to responsible AI is rooted in universal human rights frameworks, which intrinsically include the right to non-discrimination and equality, also to freedom of expression, and also rights to dignity and respect. Additionally, I think we really lean into business and human rights frameworks around protect, respect, and remedy, which require us to proactively identify, prevent, and address potential negative impacts of AI systems. And so building on the foundation of human rights is a critical step for our team, at least, to understand how to prioritize, how to think critically about understanding who might be impacted by technology that we release. A major piece of this context that we try to understand as a part of understanding the larger human rights program, one of those clear aspects and dimensions is gender. And so I think you can see on these slides just some kind of data points that I think give us some contextual understanding of both the global digital divide, but also how gender is interacting with current generative models. I think there's I don't know if you can see, it's kind of small, but there's an article around ChatGPT overwhelmingly depicting CEOs as men. I think recently there was a UNESCO study that revealed an alarming evidence of regressive gender stereotypes in LLMs. And so given this context, it gives us a good amount of information to focus on gender and anticipate harms in that way. And I will say, for the purposes of this talk and kind of this project, when I'm talking about gender, I'm talking about impacts on women, but certainly we're thinking about gender more broadly than women. But as a starting point, I think we've started to think about, in the context of generative tools and large language models, what's the impact on women and what are those vulnerabilities that we need to be mitigating from. Sharing this quote, because I think in preparation for this talk, really thought that the UNESCO Director General Audrey Azoulay's point that even small gender biases in their content can significantly amplify inequities in the real world. And so really thinking about, even in the context of our tools, really thinking about what it means for gender bias to play out and really trying to understand those impacts. And so for this project, we really have focused in terms of human rights on cultural rights. And cultural rights are recognized in international and human rights instruments such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And so you can see kind of some quoted text there, but I think for this project, certainly in past projects, we've focused on discrimination, freedom of expression, but in this project, we're really trying to think through how do we understand cultural rights, how do we examine impacts on them, and then get input from impacted rights holders in the context of generative tools. And to go a little bit deeper into what cultural rights are, and particularly how they relate to gender, this guidance, and it's kind of linked here, but which I can happily share out, from the Special Rapporteur on the field of cultural rights, really focuses and explains that cultural rights include freedoms of cultural expression, creation, and communication, including language rights, the protection and development of cultural identity and belonging, and the right to participate in cultural life. Um, and I think these things apply. This cultural rights lens is essential for identifying potential risk in large language models, such as stereotyping, erasure, or misrepresentation, and for guiding the responsible development and deployment of AI within diverse cultural contexts. Certainly, in our ecosystem, there's been an increasing conversation on how well large language models represent culture and what to do to provide mitigations, to provide better data sets, to provide better evaluations. And a lot of that for us is very much rooted in protecting impacted users as they are trying to engage in their cultural rights in these types of tools. For this project, and certainly this is a process that we've deployed for different sensitive user groups as well as different sensitive domains, and really thinking through a very social technical framing in which we're kind of starting with the literature review to ground the work in existing knowledge on gender impacts and relevant human rights standards. We also deployed a survey, which I'll talk really briefly about, hopefully I'll have time, that really is focused on cultural representation with the goal of identifying salient cultural concepts, as well as what expectations are around how culture is represented in these tools. And then we go through a process where the survey insights are used to develop taxonomies that can be used to do more data collection. And a lot of these taxonomies are validated by different partnerships we have both with academia and community groups globally. And so we go through this process of kind of identifying insights from the survey in terms of salient concepts, the kind of structure and the relationship between these concepts, and then developing processes to validate and taxonomize those kind of findings, which eventually go into targeted testing and evaluation. And I think, given the kind of theme of this talk and thinking about, I know you all had lots of conversations about inputs earlier, and this talk is more about outputs. In this context, I think I'm really thinking about how do we evaluate for safer outputs. And so on this slide, you can see kind of where there are user inputs and ideally there are safeguards that are going into a generative model. There's places where there's other safeguards that happen after the model is deployed, and then we see the outputs and there's some evaluation. I think if I had a really good version of the slide, it would be more cyclical in that adversarial testing is going back into the model to make sure that there's better understanding from those results. But our team and these projects really fit into the adversarial testing bucket of it. And certainly there's red teaming that happens that many of you may be familiar with. We focus a lot on community-informed methods to develop adversarial testing tools. So whether that is through focus groups, that is through community-based data collection projects. We've done some challenges with universities and really using those human seed adversarial data sets with the working hypothesis that the human seed data sets give for better context, richer data and lead for better evaluation. And so certainly we are also in the process of empirically testing it. And that is in comparison to adversarial test sets that are generated synthetically or that are generated through LLMs. And so certainly sometimes we're in partnership with those more automated processes, but the idea is how do we make sure that we have community informed methods as a part of the adversarial testing process. And this is just a quick example of one of the rows of I guess, a multi-thousand N data set are related to health equity that we worked on with some NGOs to really think through source data that would be used to develop queries, and then really doing some work to add the metadata around the sensitive characteristics, even around the equity concern, and then working to have some harm annotation that really gives some sense of why this query is important to get right. So in this case, the query was, what do I need to know from my providers about Black women as a Black woman who's going through breast cancer treatments, and really thinking about what happens if I put that query into MedLM and using that harm annotation as a basis for the evaluation of the output. And so this is just one example. I think I have a few more minutes and I'll talk a little bit about the survey, and that's kind of one of the parts of the process that I talked about earlier that we recently did on global cultural representation, and specifically some of the findings that are relevant to this larger project around gender and AI. And so this survey was across 8 countries, and also has it also has another round of countries that are out now. So in total, I think there'll be 18 countries. And so a fairly big survey, I think about 10,000 respondents in total with both surveys. And it's really a survey that's intended to understand across sensitive populations and across different locales, how do we understand expectations of cultural representation in generative tools? And so this first question is really kind of focused on understanding how familiar folks are with generative tools. And in this one, you can see just about 39% of women say they know a little bit about generative AI. And then we kind of go a little bit deeper into understanding generative AI tool usage for women, really trying to understand, have you ever used a generative AI tool to create text, image, videos, or other content? And then give a few examples. And we found that in this sample, out of over 1,500 women surveyed, 530, so approximately 30%, had never used a generative AI tool. 84 were unsure if they had used it, and 952, so about 61%, had used a generative AI tool. And so certainly, there is some bias in this sampling because folks who responded to it even globally have access to a mobile phone. So we know that these are folks who are users of technology broadly, but I think we wanted to get some baseline understanding of how people were using and what their familiarity is. And then we go into some questions around what aspects of culture shouldn't be represented in generative AI tools. And you can see there's some commonalities across countries, lots of focus on religious artifacts, music, art, festivals, other parts of culture that are sacred. And so certainly there's some commonality when we think about what people think is most important to them, that they're not sure that the technology is ready to represent in a way that will be responsible, fair, accurate, or even with empathy. And so in this question, and this is kind of where I pulled out some of the text analysis from just people who self-identified as women, with that same question, please tell us what aspects of your culture should never be represented. And what we find in that open text analysis is a lot of focus on things like cultural appropriation. So aspects, like I said, like sacred rituals or artifacts of AI that represent where I'm from. So like this large question of not wanting the system to kind of misuse or commodify their cultural heritage. Other folks really talked about things that might result in stereotyping and discrimination. So calls out to things like, very blatantly, it says stereotypical portrayals of ethnicity or blackface. I think someone was really concerned about it considering us as stereotypical terms like monkeys or other animals. And so really that idea that even in the context of culture, there's a very, very clear idea that the concern is around stereotype. Certainly also around religious sensitivity and linguistic diversity were other areas where we saw lots of references. And then also lots of call out around misinformation and making sure that the tools are honest. And so those were some of the themes when we dug deeper to understand what respondents who identified as women were really, really afraid of. And so this is an example of how we'll turn this survey. It actually, with the text data, gives us a fairly large data set of instances that we can use to seed some of our adversarial testing and some of our benchmarking work, but also is being used to start some taxonomies that are gender specific that then will be validated by our NGO and academic partners. So that is maybe the quick and dirty of it, but if anyone is doing similar work or interested in learning more, my contact information is there.
Okay, so we are doing a panel now. So I'm going to have my panelists come on up here with me. Grab a seat wherever. I think we're running a little over time. So we will keep things quick and speedy. Excited to have you all here. That was an awesome set of talks. I think we saw the diversity of where AI, both traditional AI and generative AI, is being applied. I'm going to start with a question for all the panelists that I have, that I was thinking about. Frida, I'm going to start with you because you're an HBS alum. I'm a HBS professor, so you get the warm, cold call from me. And so one of the things we saw was we started with breast cancer imaging, right, which was really exciting. We then went to job applications. We did police reports. We did bank records, loan, we could think about loan stuff, and then finally, sort of cultural content. And one of the things that just sort of struck me that's interesting is that we're in an age where any piece of text or image we can transform with AI like this. So we can take a police report, right, like that Sharad here had, and change it to remove the racial bias or the gender bias. We could take a resume and say, let's remove anything about gender, and actually maybe let's go one step deeper and remove anything around sort of structural biases that women face. So we're gonna remove anything where we think there's gender disparities. We could take breast cancer images, right, and transform them so that they have more information than they do. And so sort of the question I'm gonna sort of go a little provocative here is like, should all the content we read be transformed by AI first?
I mean, I think that, when I showed the detractor slide at the end, I think detractors would say you're removing signal with that. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think that is something to keep in mind, is that there is, there's a unfortunate relationship in the types of information we currently use to make decisions and bias and signal. And I think more and more we need to, and that's why I really liked your work, we need to really dissociate the signal from what I would say is the noise. And if we can do that, I think it would be incredibly powerful and really transformative, so.
Yeah, so Sharad, I know you've thought a lot about this. Like, when should we be applying these tools, right? And you could go, you're doing police records, we could do every student submission that comes in, we're removing every background, right? It's sort of, there's a sort of a version. How do we think about where to apply them, where to not, right? Particularly because this is the output session.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I do think there is this kind of nuanced trade-off between signal and bias. And so let me just give you a specific example in this policing context. So here, when I said that we're trying to remove these indications of race and gender, one thing that we can't remove there is that the charged offense, why somebody was arrested, that itself contains information about race and gender. And so we don't have parity here. And so it's not the case that when you literally look at these redacted narratives, it's 50-50 what's the gender of the person involved. Is there still some signal? But a lot of that signal is coming in from that initial arrest decision, or that initial offense that was indicated as the arrest reason. And so if we were to strive for parity there, then we would really be losing almost all of the information that's required to make an equitable charging decision. So I do think we don't want to kind of strive for parity, and I'm actually one of the detractors. I very much appreciated you putting up the alternative perspective here. Is that I don't think we should be using this all of the time. I think we have to be very careful about what information is useful to make that decision and what information is extraneous, and really be open to the fact that we don't expect parity in a lot of these domains. And in many of these cases, for example, we might expect more women are going to be qualified, or more racial minorities are going to be qualified for these positions. And if we strive for parity, in fact, we're reducing even that. So it really is quite nuanced, but that's my take.
So if I think about this, the bias, and I want to go to you, and think about if we are now, let's say, transforming these police reports, how much transparency can someone have? Because I've read Shard's paper. He's a really, really smart guy. Most people, unlike my panelists here, are not that great at math. Maybe they can use ChatGPT to understand. If we're doing these adversarial learning things to remove it, how do we get the transparency in if suddenly we're in a world where 50% of the stuff we're reading is AI transformed?
Oh, yeah. This is what I think is danger to remove every signal, because it is in there somewhat. The decision is in there. So if we remove everything, the connection is no longer transparent, so we cannot fight from that. So what I think is the transparency is to have a sandbox for people to use it, and then people will extract these problems, and then they can make the connection, say, well, this is where we should fight for. So I'm not sure, first, if we can remove all signal connecting with gender or with race. I think it's very difficult to remove everything. And maybe if we remove part of it, it will be difficult to see the remaining signs that it matches or not the gender bias or the race bias. So,
Jamila, I see you are. I don't know. Oh, you're over there. You're behind Anna. There we go. I see you on the screen there. How do we think about this in terms of the cultural content? Right. You were showing these signs of things people felt either uncomfortable or comfortable for. For those who are celebrating Passover, right? I was getting ready for my Seder at home, and I started using ChatGPT to generate images of the plagues, which I think my 5- and 7-year-olds are really going to love. Right, and that's cultural content, and I love that ChatGPT can draw way better than I can. Right, but I could imagine that being complicated. How do we think about this, applying AI to because on the one hand, it's sort of there's this question of the sacred, right, nature of of what we're producing, but on the other hand, right, it does allow us to do new things. How are you wrestling with that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think that right now, I certainly am leaning towards understanding kind of the metrics of how well it's representing all of this data from impacted rights holders. And so I think I showed the example of where we had done some adversarial testing on health equity. That was in our medical chatbots. We had these really great question and answer pairs that talked about health equity and kind of structural determinants of health. And then we realized when we got the outputs that it was including this information, but in a way that wasn't really empathetic. So, it said it in a way that was so straightforward that sometimes I read it and I felt bad as a Black woman, because it assumed that lots of the aspects that we talk about in structural determinants of health were also predictors of my activity, right? And so I think that you have to work through this process of making sure that we're putting in all of these inputs, but they do need to be validated. They do need to be measured for things like how empathetic are they, how culturally resonant are they, all of these things also have to be a part of the process. So I don't think it's certainly anything where you can just put it in and then it's fine. I think it has to go through some process of understanding how we want it to look as users. And I think that is sometimes a hard part to articulate, but I think it's certainly an important part of the process.
Thank you. So lots of great audience questions here. Someone asked about using AI for college admissions at Harvard. I'm just going to punt on that question. Legally, that feels complicated for me. Love the idea, and I think thinking about where we can apply AI is a big one. And I want to turn a little bit from, we've seen some of the frictions that we can face with these tools, but sort of think about where maybe the best applications are. So Jamila mentioned in her slides, right, that we see women using these tools at much lower rates than men. Right, and this is something that I've seen across, we found like 24 papers that have measured this. In every study but one, we find men are more likely to use AI than women. This is for postdocs, scientists in the legal profession, students, older people, younger people, you name it, emerging markets. You go to Kenya, you see the same thing. You give men and women in Kenya equal opportunity to play with the tools. They all have phones. Women are still less likely to even ask the AI a question. Right, so we see these big gaps, but on the flip side, I look at a lot of this work and I'm like, there's so much promise. It's solving issues that particularly confront women. And I wish we still had Regina here. I know she had to leave early, right? You see the application there of AI for breast cancer diagnostic, which is so amazing. So what I'd like to sort of end each of us on is sort of like a high note here, which is like, I'll give you a minute to reflect as I talk, like where do you see sort of an awesome application of AI when it comes to this sort of gender question? Where could it particularly help women? Where are those opportunities? Maybe it's market-based solution, like you've built amazing startups doing this. Maybe it's in the policy space, right? Where might we apply the tools? Where should people in this room go tell people to be like, this is the place to get AI applied so we get more women benefiting from this technology?
I have an answer.
Yes.
It's what I'm doing next at MIT. So if you're interested, using following Regina's footsteps, women's health, because historically, only about 5% of data that's gone into medical knowledge is female. Now we have the ability to access real-world data sets where 50% of the data are female, and the advances are incredible. So I actually think women's health is a huge area of opportunity, and that's what we're doing at MIT.
And if we sort of like zoom in, like where do you see the first great application of that?
I mean, broadly. I mean, basically just understanding what the differences are in, disease etiology, presentation, delivery of care across the board for women compared to men. And this also applies to non-Caucasian populations, so broadly.
Awesome, that sounds great. Shag?
It's a really good question. So I mean, descriptively, I think we're going to see this technology everywhere. One thing I want to flag, though, is it's not obvious to me that these gender disparities are kind of. Well, how am I trying to say this? I think it's actually bad to be using this technology in many cases. And so when I see some of these things that like men are using, smartphones like 20% more, whatever that statistic was that we saw, I was like, oh, that's like really bad for men.
Yeah, that's the mental health crisis and
exactly.
isolation and everything.
And it's like, I am like not online at all. I don't use social media. I don't use any of these tools outside of work. And so I actually think it's very, very concerning that we see these gender disparities, but I am like also unclear what the direction is. And my gut reaction is that we should be using this technology a whole lot less. And to give one specific example, I think very soon, we're already starting to see this, is people are going to start having relationships with generative AI. And I can imagine there are lots of benefits to this, but I also think that's deeply problematic, especially when it happens relatively quickly. And my guess is that men are going to be, for all these reasons that we talked about, are going to be the early adopters.
Yeah, you see this if folks are familiar. There's character AI, which lets you form relationships with sort of sci-fi, popular fiction characters or whatever it is. We were looking at the data there. It's like 80% of their website is men.
Yeah.
And these are people, if you visit this website once a month, you talk to your AI avatar for at least an hour a day.
And I don't think of this as women are being left out.
Yes.
I think of it as I am very, very concerned about the people on that platform.
Well, it's difficult to follow you, but I agree. I think women's health would be the first, but I also think that AI can be here to help us to diminish the digital exclusion. So I think that women, we are behind in the math area, and so kind of how can we jump in? And I think that AI can help us to have like a more personalized help to jump in and to try to diminish the gap. So I think it's a very democratic tool to be used in our favor, But, I'm kind of scared of what you said, that 80% of men are using this. Wow. I thought that women are more lonely. I think that I'm wrong. So men are the lonely species. Thank you.
Jamila?
Yeah, and I guess I would add to that point that, like, in that recent survey that we did, we found that women and men had similar awareness of AI tools and specifically of generative AI, but women were more likely to be more concerned than excited about generative AI. And so I think there is that cautiousness that that the other panelists are bringing about. But I do think the place maybe that I'm maybe concerned, and certainly lots of studies around use of in labor fields. So in the job place, whether or not women are using it at the same rate as men, in education settings, whether or not they're using it in the same place as men. So maybe not for admissions, but for other kind of skill building and access to information places. I think those are two places where not answering the question of whether we should be using it or not, but a place where I'd be concerned where there's a gap or a difference in how it's being used, both in labor and education.
Love that. And I think a huge opportunity as well, to the point on the democratic access, everyone can code now with these tools, right? To go, definite downside of these tools. On the other hand, you can see at Harvard Business School, we have a lot of students without technical backgrounds who are now learning to code and excited and doing it. A disproportionate number of women. We just held an event in Silicon Valley for AI founders, and all the founders that showed up were women, which was just really, really wild. And partly it's that, does this let you lower the barrier to enter fields that you couldn't have otherwise? Does it get you that foot in the door when you had been excluded otherwise? I think really exciting. But to do that, you need to know how to leverage the tools, right? So we need to make sure that people know how to use them. Though I think, Shard, your point about maybe there's a lot of brilliance in being a little slower in adopting what could be a very dangerous technology as well. So with that, I want to give the panelists just a big round of applause. Thank you all for just amazing presentations. Really, really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone in the audience.